History remembers her as a monarch of brilliance, a reformer, a lover of art, a woman who defied an empire. But behind the gold and silk of Catherine, the Great's throne, lay a world few dared to whisper about. Within the frozen corridors of the Winter Palace, power was not earned through virtue, it was taken through flesh, deceit, and fear. Tonight, we step beyond the portraits and propaganda into the Empress's private world, where desire became ritual and cruelty became law. This is not the legend of Catherine the Great. This is the hidden chronicle of her nights, where innocence was bartered, love was punished, and an empire was ruled from the shadows of her bedchamber. In 1744, under a sky heavy with Russian snow, a young German princess arrived at the gates of St. Petersburg. Her name was Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, 16, pale, and trembling beneath furs that could not protect her from what awaited inside. She was brought to marry the Grand Duke Peter, heir to the Russian throne, a union forged not from affection, but from politics, ambition, and quiet desperation. The Winter Palace glittered like a celestial trap. Its marble halls echoed with the steps of courtiers who smiled too quickly, whose words carried more venom than warmth. Every glance measured her worth, not as a person, but as an instrument, a vessel through which bloodlines might strengthen or fall. Empress Elizabeth, radiant and unpredictable, watched the girl with a gaze that weighed both admiration and suspicion. Catherine, as Sophie would soon be renamed, learned that in this empire, a woman's value was carved by obedience and endurance. Her tutors drilled her in Russian, in etiquette, in silence. They taught her to move like a shadow among predators, never to speak before spoken to, never to reveal thought behind the eyes. In her chambers, she wrote in secret diaries by candlelight, her only rebellion against the stillness demanded of her. She described the stifling perfume of the court, the whisper of silk gowns brushing past her door, the hollow laughter echoing from banquets where she was forbidden to speak. She felt like a bird trapped behind crystal, admired but voiceless. Peter, her betrothed, was everything she feared. Immature, volatile, more fascinated by toy soldiers and foreign drink than the empire he would one day inherit. His cruelty was not deliberate. It was careless, the cruelty of a boy who had never learned consequence. Catherine began to understand that her marriage would not be salvation. It would be her sentence. The walls of her room grew closer each night. Even the icons on her walls seemed to avert their painted eyes. Outside, the Neva River froze over, silent beneath the moon. Inside, the future Empress learned the first rule of survival, the art of stillness. She observed. She memorized. She listened. She saw how servants traded secrets for safety, how generals bowed lower to gossip than to kings, how the Empress herself wielded affection like a weapon. Catherine learned the politics of glances, the currency of charm, the economy of silence. Every humiliation became instruction. Every constraint, a lesson in patience. She began to realize that the empire did not rest on armies or decrees. It rested on the quiet manipulations behind locked doors. In that realization, something inside her shifted. The frightened girl from Prussia began to fade, replaced by a colder version of herself, disciplined, observant, calculating. The courtiers called her meek. They were wrong. Behind her lowered lashes, something dark was forming, the seed of ambition, born from confinement. Years later, those who had seen her in those early days would recall her serenity, her composure, her near-saintly calm. None would know that behind those still eyes, a storm was gathering, one that would one day drown Russia in its quiet, merciless tide. The golden cage had not broken her. It had forged her. The marriage of Catherine and Peter was not a union, it was a spectacle. In 1745, beneath chandeliers heavy with candle smoke, the Winter Palace gleamed as choirs sang and courtiers whispered. The ceremony was magnificent, its sanctity wrapped in hypocrisy. Russia celebrated the promise of a royal heir, But behind every toast lingered a quiet mockery. For everyone knew this was not love. It was strategy. Peter arrived drunk to the altar, his uniform misbuttoned, his eyes glassy with childish delight. Catherine stood beside him, her hands trembling not from devotion, but from dread. She repeated the vows in a language she had only recently mastered, words that bound her to a man she did not know and a destiny she could not yet comprehend. That night, when the palace lights dimmed, the celebration gave way to silence. The Empress herself waited anxiously for word that the marriage had been consummated, a confirmation that the young bride had served her political purpose. But hours passed, and the silence deepened. Behind the closed door of the bridal chamber, the scene was bleak. Peter, lost in drunken stupor, spoke not to his wife but to his toy soldiers, lined on the table beside their bed. He laughed at their tin faces, mimicking battles from his imaginary Prussian wars. Catherine sat still, veiled in disbelief, realizing that her husband was less a man than a frightened boy encased in royal silk. When dawn crept across the frosted windows, she remained untouched, humiliated, and terribly awake. The court would soon know. The Empress would hear. And laughter, cold, cruel laughter, would follow her down the corridors for years to come. The whispers began at once. Servants giggled in corners. Noblewomen smirked behind their fans. They said the Grand Duchess had failed to please her husband, that her beauty was wasted on him, or perhaps worse, that she was barren already. The rumors clung to her like frost on glass. Catherine learned how shame could be weaponized, how silence could be a sentence. Yet, within that humiliation, something hardened. She learned to wear her disgrace as armor, to smile through mockery, to appear serene when the room vibrated with cruelty. If she could not command affection, she would command attention. If she could not win her husband, she would win the empire that mocked her. Each day she endured became a study in control. She mastered the art of restraint, the stillness of the face, the calm of the voice, the careful distribution of truth. Even in her misery, she began to observe how power operated in the shadows, how servants carried secrets, how noblemen traded favors through gossip, how the Empress's moods could rewrite destinies. Peter's neglect grew into open ridicule. He flaunted his mistresses, insulted her in public, paraded soldiers through their chambers. The palace became a theater of humiliation, and Catherine, its silent actress. But beneath the mask, she plotted quietly, learning where each thread of loyalty led. One evening, as she passed a mirror in the dark, she barely recognized the reflection. The girl who had arrived from Prussia was gone, replaced by a woman sculpted by isolation and cruelty. Outside, snow fell endlessly over St. Petersburg, muffling every sound except her heartbeat, steady, defiant, alive. The marriage had failed before it began, but within its ruins, Catherine discovered something more enduring than love, the will to outlast humiliation and to one day make it serve her. The years that followed were years of quiet endurance. Catherine had mastered invisibility, a skill more powerful than beauty. While Peter paraded his immaturity through drunken insults and reckless games, she retreated into silence. But silence, in the Winter Palace, was never empty. It listened. It learned. Catherine began to surround herself with people who owed her nothing: scholars, guards, ladies-in-waiting forgotten by court favor. She read forbidden books, the works of French philosophers who spoke of liberty and reason, their ideas flickering like secret candles in the dark. Within those pages, she found language for what she had already begun to feel, that power was not inherited, it was taken. Her first lover was not chosen from affection, but necessity. Sergei Saltykov, young, vain, ambitious, saw in Catherine the potential to rise. She saw in him an opportunity to test her influence. Their encounters were not romantic whispers, but political rehearsals. She learned how to read a man's hunger and mirror it back to him until he mistook obedience for devotion. Soon, Others followed, courtiers, guards, men of promise and ego. Catherine's chambers became a quiet stage, where alliances were sealed through touch and trust. Each lover believed himself chosen. Each became a pawn in a larger design. It was not lust that drove her, but strategy, the slow construction of loyalty in a world where words could not be trusted. Outside her chamber, the empire groaned. The Empress Elizabeth aged and sickened. Factions fought to position themselves for the inevitable succession. Peter's foolish admiration for Prussia and open contempt for Russia made him despised by nearly everyone. Catherine, in contrast, spoke softly of Russia's greatness, of the people, of order and reform. Her image began to shift from neglected wife to potential savior. Whispers about her lovers circulated through the palace, but they no longer wounded her. She had learned to use rumor as veil to hide her intentions behind scandal. The men she took were not her weakness. They were her weapons. Through them, she gathered information, secured loyalty, and placed quiet hands in every corner of the court. At night, she would write by candlelight, her pen steady. "I am surrounded by enemies," she noted, "yet none can strike without my permission." Her words were not pride, but prophecy. In those years of secrecy, Catherine discovered the paradox of power, that it could be both intoxicating and imprisoning. Each victory demanded another mask. Each alliance risked betrayal. The more control she gained, the more she feared the exposure of her own design. And yet, she continued. For every man who entered her confidence, there was another ready to fall. Her calmness unnerved them. Her patience disarmed them. When others spoke of fate, she spoke of timing. By the time the Empress Elizabeth's health began to fail, Catherine's network stretched across the empire. Ministers, guards, generals, and courtiers who would bend their allegiance not to the Tsar, but to the woman they now called the Little Mother. The Empress of the future was already reigning, not from the throne, but from the shadows of her bedchamber. Each night, she extinguished her candle with the same thought echoing in her mind. Power is born in darkness. To hold it, one must become the darkness itself. By the winter of 1761, the empire trembled beneath uncertainty. Empress Elizabeth lay dying, her beauty faded, her mind fading with it. In the shadows of her chambers, courtiers began their quiet war, deciding who would inherit not the crown, but control of Russia itself. And in that feverish silence, Catherine waited. When Elizabeth's heart finally stopped, the bells of St. Petersburg tolled not in grief, but in forewarning. Peter III, the boy who once mocked his wife before his soldiers, now wore the imperial crown. His reign began with laughter, and within months, that laughter would echo into his ruin. Peter idolized Frederick of Prussia, Russia's sworn enemy. He sought to undo everything Elizabeth had fought for, replacing Russian valor with foreign mimicry. He wore Prussian uniforms, drilled his soldiers in foreign mannerisms, and openly mocked the Orthodox Church. The people called him the foreigner emperor, a man enthroned by accident, ruling through insult. Catherine watched it unfold from behind veiled composure. Her humiliation had taught her patience. Her silence had given her clarity. She began to meet quietly with Gregory Orlov, a young officer of the Imperial Guard, strong, loyal, and dangerously devoted to her. Through him and his brothers, she began to pull the first threads of conspiracy. The plan was not born in a single night. It grew slowly, like frost across glass. Catherine knew that failure meant death, not just for her, but for every name whispered in allegiance. Yet, as Peter's madness deepened, so too did her resolve. Peter abandoned his wife, flaunting his mistress publicly, mocking Catherine even at council meetings. He planned to annul their marriage, send her to a convent, and name his mistress Empress. When word reached Catherine, she did not weep, she acted. In June of 1762, as Peter prepared for war games at Arnhenbaum, Catherine moved silently through the corridors of the Winter Palace. At dawn, she appeared before the guards, dressed not as a captive wife but as a ruler, the green sash of the Imperial Guard across her chest, her expression calm and unflinching. The soldiers, weary of Peter's mockery, fell to their knees. Within hours, the coup was complete. Catherine rode through St. Petersburg on horseback, her face pale and unreadable, while church bells rang in her name. She was proclaimed Empress of all Russia, not by decree, but by devotion of those who had long waited for deliverance. Peter fled to his estate, bewildered and broken. Days later, he was arrested, imprisoned in Rapsha, and cut off from the world he once mocked. Catherine's orders were clear: no harm unless necessary. But power has a way of silencing mercy. On the 7th night of his captivity, Peter III was found dead, strangled after a drunken quarrel with his guards. Officially, it was an unfortunate accident. Unofficially, it was the first blood Catherine carried on her crown. When the news reached her, she stood before the mirror and said nothing. Her eyes did not betray relief or remorse, only acceptance. The empire hailed her as savior. The church called it divine providence. But within the silence of her private chamber, Catherine understood the truth. She had killed not her husband, but the last remnant of her innocence. The woman the world would call great was born in the shadow of a corpse. Catherine's coronation in Moscow was the grandest in living memory. Beneath the gilded domes of the Kremlin, choirs thundered and incense filled the air, yet behind every hymn lay unease. She was a woman on a stolen throne, crowned by soldiers' loyalty and sealed with her husband's blood. The empire bowed but watched closely. Outwardly, she ruled with composure. She reformed schools, invited scholars, and presented herself as enlightened, the philosopher queen of Russia. But within the polished calm of her reign, an invisible chamber was forming, not of politics, but of desire and control. The years of humiliation had carved something deep into her, a hunger not for affection, but for command. Power in public demanded restraint. Power in private demanded obedience. Thus began the rituals whispered only in the palace's darkest corridors, a private court within the court, where chosen officers, guards, and noblemen entered as servants of the Empress and emerged stripped of pride, bound to her will. The chamber itself was a secret known only to a few, an antechamber of red velvet and candlelight, where silence was absolute. There, Catherine tested not just loyalty, but submission. Every gesture, every gaze was a declaration of hierarchy. The Empress did not need to raise her voice. Her stillness was enough. To those closest to her, these encounters seemed like devotion, acts of private worship to a living goddess. To others, they were trials, the price of favor in a world ruled by fear and fascination. Many entered willingly, believing that intimacy with the Empress was the highest honor. Few understood that they were surrendering more than their bodies. They were surrendering themselves. Outside those guarded doors, Catherine remained untouchable, the image of progress and reason. She corresponded with Voltaire, patronized the arts, and spoke of humanity's moral awakening. But at night, when the palace fell silent, she revisited the rituals that reminded her she was master of what once enslaved her. For Catherine, power and punishment had become indistinguishable. She had learned that control was sweetest when it was voluntary, when those she ruled begged to serve. The same empire that once mocked her now adored her with trembling devotion. She had become both savior and tormentor, priestess and executioner of her own faith. Those who left her favor often vanished quietly. Some were reassigned to distant garrisons. Others met accidents no one dared investigate. The palace learned its rhythm. Obedience ensured comfort. Rebellion ensured silence. And yet, behind the grandeur, there were nights when Catherine sat alone before her mirror, searching her reflection for the woman she once was. She no longer recognized her. The girl who had once trembled under the weight of a crown now stared back with the calm of one who had conquered fear itself, but in conquering it, had become its source. The Chamber of Obedience remained her most guarded secret, a symbol of her paradox. She ruled an empire by daylight, but by night she ruled the hearts and wills of men as if to prove endlessly that she could never again be powerless. History would remember her as enlightened, reformist, benevolent. But behind the curtain of her throne, Catherine's truest reforms were not written in law. They were etched into those who dared to love her. Power, once won, demands to be feared. By the late 1760s, Catherine's rule was absolute. Her armies expanded across steppes and seas. Her portraits hung in every noble house. Yet the more her empire adored her, the more she felt its adoration rot into suspicion. Greatness, she realized, was never loved, only obeyed. Rumors began as whispers in foreign courts, tales too grotesque to believe, yet too delicious to dismiss. It was said that the Empress's appetites were unnatural, her desires insatiable, her nights filled with rituals beyond decency. Some claimed she kept a hidden chamber beneath the palace, where her pleasures turned to punishments. Others swore that she shared her bed with creatures no human should touch. One story in particular spread like infection, that Catherine's fascination with her private menagerie, lions, peacocks, and exotic beasts sent as gifts by foreign rulers, had turned into something monstrous. French pamphlets spoke of a mechanical device built to satisfy her unnatural cravings, its design inspired by the very animals she admired. It was obscene, absurd, impossible, and precisely for that reason, unforgettable. Catherine never addressed these rumors. She understood their purpose. The myth of her corruption made her invincible. To deny it would invite mockery. To embrace it would inspire fear. So she remained silent, the silence of one who knows that legends, once born, can serve better than truth. But silence has its cost. Within her own walls, the myth began to consume reality. Servants avoided her gaze. Courtiers bowed too deeply. Her lovers, once eager, now entered her chambers with reverence tinged by dread. She could feel it in the air, the way her presence emptied rooms, the way laughter died when she entered. Power had made her divine, and divinity, she discovered, was another word for loneliness. At night, she wandered her halls, lit only by flickering lamps. Paintings of her ancestors stared down with judgment she could almost hear. Sometimes she paused before the iron cage where her prized black panther slept. Its eyes, unblinking, mirrored her own, majestic, predatory, and endlessly alone. She spoke to it softly, as one might to a confidant. "They call me Beast," she whispered once, "but beasts kill only to eat. Men kill to rule." Perhaps it was confession. Perhaps it was madness. Her advisors noticed the change, the increasing isolation, the erratic moods. Yet none dared question her. They feared not the woman, but the myth she had become. Outside Russia, diplomats recoiled from her name. Inside Russia, peasants prayed to her image. The Empress of flesh and iron, the woman who ruled by desire and decree. Catherine had turned scandal into empire, her sin into sovereignty. Still, in the privacy of her chamber, she sometimes dreamt of the life she might have lived, the quiet one denied to her long ago. But when she awoke, the golden cage was gone, replaced by a throne too heavy to abandon. The rumors would outlive her, as all great lies do. And though she would never confirm nor deny them, they achieved what she desired most. They made her untouchable. For a ruler of men, fear is worth more than virtue. Catherine had become both myth and monster, and she no longer cared which ruled Russia, so long as it obeyed her. By the 1770s, Catherine's empire stood vast and glittering, yet beneath the gilded surface, rot spread like unseen mold. Her lovers, once chosen for beauty and wit, had become acquisitions, living trophies of loyalty. The Empress who once commanded armies now collected hearts with the same ruthless precision she used to conquer cities. They called her the Collector of Flesh. The name began in whispers among foreign diplomats, then crept into the diaries of courtiers who feared she might one day read them. To be chosen by Catherine was an honor. To be dismissed by her was a slow execution of reputation. Few survived her affection unchanged. Each new favorite was handpicked by her trusted aide, Gregory Potemkin, soldier, strategist, and perhaps the only man who understood that Catherine's desire was less for love than for control. He screened candidates like generals examine maps, measuring obedience, silence, and beauty. The chosen ones were housed in elegant chambers, educated in poetry, etiquette, and the secret rituals of pleasure. To outsiders, it seemed decadent. To those within the palace, it was a system of survival. Catherine's affections were unpredictable, her punishments merciless. Yet she was not cruel for cruelty's sake. Every act, every dismissal was an experiment in loyalty. She wanted to know who would love her as a woman and obey her as a god. Potemkin watched this with fascination and fear. He loved her, perhaps more than any man could, but he knew the Empress's heart was a throne room with no empty seat. Once, during an evening of wine and candlelight, he dared to ask her, "Do you ever tire of testing them?" Catherine smiled, her eyes distant. "I do not test them, Gregory. I test myself. To rule men, one must learn how easily they break." In that moment, Potemkin realized that she no longer ruled through affection or faith. She ruled through anatomy, dissecting loyalty as one might dissect flesh. There were rumors, of course. Some claimed she kept portraits of every discarded lover locked away in a private gallery, their faces framed beside verses written in her own hand. Others whispered that she demanded tokens, a lock of hair, a tooth, a piece of jewelry, kept in a chest she never opened, but never destroyed. Whether these tales were true or invented, they revealed one truth about her reign. Catherine's power was not just political. It was intimate, invasive, and terrifyingly personal. Her palace became a theater of devotion. Lovers knelt not before a woman, but before an empire disguised in silk. Ministers, generals, poets, all reduced to trembling offerings before her gaze. Yet, in rare moments of solitude, the Empress would walk among the portraits hung in her private corridor. She would linger before each painted face, young men whose smiles had once promised eternity, now trapped forever in the varnish of her memory. She touched one frame once and whispered, "All of you loved me for the crown, not the woman beneath it." The echo of that confession filled the chamber like a ghost sigh. For all her wealth, Catherine understood poverty, the poverty of affection that true power brings. Outside, Russia worshipped her as the enlightened Empress, the mother of progress. Inside, she was a collector haunted by her own collection. Power had given her everything except peace. And in that absence, she began to fear that the only loyalty left to her was fear itself. Winter descended upon St. Petersburg like a punishment. The river froze to silence, and the wind moaned through the corridors of the Winter Palace, carrying with it the whisper of forgotten vows. Catherine no longer attended banquets. The light that once illuminated her throne now flickered faintly behind drawn velvet curtains. Servants noticed changes in her habits. She avoided mirrors, as if her reflection accused her. At night, she would order candles to be placed along the gallery of portraits, those same faces of former favorites, preserved in oil and varnish. She called it her Hall of Remembrance. Others called it her Tomb of the Living. Each portrait stared back at her with the unblinking calm of judgment. The painter's brush had immortalized the softness of youth, but time had given them new expressions: disappointment, resentment, sorrow. When the flames trembled, the shadows across their painted eyes seemed almost alive. Catherine would wander there in silence, the hem of her gown brushing against the marble floor, her fingers tracing the frames as if touching skin. She spoke to them sometimes, not with madness, but with a kind of weary reverence. "You wanted love," she murmured once before the portrait of a boy barely 20. "I gave you immortality instead." Outside, the empire she built strained under its own weight. Rebellions festered, and foreign courts plotted her downfall. Yet the Empress's war was now internal, fought against the ghosts that history itself refused to bury. Potemkin noticed the change too. His letters to her, once filled with strategy and devotion, grew desperate. "You speak to shadows, Ekaterina," he wrote. "But shadows do not answer. You are the sun. Remember that before you fade into your own eclipse." But she did not reply. The woman who once commanded nations now spoke only to paintings and silence. Some said she saw them move. A servant swore that one night, when the storm outside howled like a dying beast, the candles along the portrait hall extinguished themselves one by one, as footsteps echoed behind the Empress, though no one was there. She was found the next morning seated in her chair, pale, eyes fixed on the portrait of Orlov, the man who once helped her overthrow her husband. Her hand still clutched a small locket he had given her decades before. Historians later described this as a nervous collapse brought on by exhaustion. But within the palace, the servants whispered another story, that Catherine had begun to see every portrait, not as a memory, but as an accusation. That the faces spoke to her, in dreams, in candlelight, in silence, reminding her of the price of power. Her once grand chambers now smelled of wax, ink, and dust. Reports of her illness reached foreign courts, but no one could diagnose what ailed her. For how do you treat a woman consumed not by disease, but by remembrance? In her final months, Catherine ordered the gallery to be sealed. "Let the eyes of the past rest," she told her attendants. But even after the doors were locked, servants claimed to hear faint tapping from within, as if the painted hands were knocking to be let out. For an empire built on conquest, the greatest territory she could never master was her own conscience. The portraits did not fade. They waited, patient, eternal, and watching, for the night when the Empress would join their ranks. On the evening of November 16th, 1796, the Winter Palace stood in unnatural quiet. The court had grown accustomed to the Empress's solitude, yet that night the silence felt heavier, as though the walls themselves held their breath. Outside, snow drifted down like falling ash, muffling the world in white. Within, a single candle burned beside Catherine's writing desk. The Empress was alone. Potemkin was long dead, her lovers scattered, her heirs already circling the throne like carrion birds. Only the portraits remained, their eyes hidden behind the locked doors of the sealed gallery. But Catherine did not need to see them anymore. She could feel them, watching from the dark corners of her mind. For hours she wrote in silence, her quill trembling slightly. Witnesses later said she was drafting new reforms, even in her final hours, laws to modernize Russia once more. But the parchment before her contained no decrees. It was a list of names. Names of those who had served her, loved her, and betrayed her. Beside each, a single mark, a cross, a circle, or nothing at all. Historians would never decipher its meaning. Perhaps it was her final judgment or her confession. Around midnight, she rose from her chair. Her steps were slow, deliberate. The air was thick with the scent of candle wax and iron, a familiar perfume of the palace that had become her prison. She passed through the corridors one last time, her hand brushing the walls as though bidding farewell to every secret they had swallowed. In the grand hall, she paused before the portrait of herself, painted years ago when her power was absolute and her beauty legendary. The face in the painting was proud, cold, untouched by remorse. The face that stared back from the dim mirror nearby was aged, hollow, and unbearably human. A draft of wind extinguished the candle beside her. For the first time in decades, Catherine felt fear. Not of death, but of being forgotten. At dawn, The attendants found her collapsed upon the floor of her private chamber. The ink on her desk was still wet, the parchment torn beneath her hand. The doctors declared it an apoplexy, a stroke swift and final. But among the servants, another story spread, that she had died reaching for the gallery door, as though something on the other side had called her name. When Paul, her estranged son, assumed the throne, one of his first decrees was to open that forbidden corridor. The portraits, untouched by dust or decay, glimmered faintly in the candlelight. Some claimed the eyes seemed brighter than before, alive as if aware that their collector had finally joined them. Her body was laid in the cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, among the emperors she had outshone. The city mourned her as a visionary, a reformer, a conqueror. Yet in the whispers of the servants and the diaries of courtiers, another legacy lingered, of a woman who ruled the world but could not rule her heart. And when night falls upon the Neva, old attendants say the winter palace still hums with quiet footsteps, the rustle of silk, the faint sound of a woman's sigh echoing through locked corridors. Perhaps it is only the wind, or perhaps it is the Empress herself, still walking among her portraits, searching for one face that truly loved her, and finding none.